Thanks very much. Sorry about the problems with the hearing, and we're going to try to work with this thing. It's going to hamper me a little bit. Let me tell you why. Times have changed in schools when the most common question you get is, do you have PowerPoint? The answer is no. I'm old school, okay? But I actually have a better reason. I have this lecture on PowerPoint, but I quit using it because I don't like that kind of stuff. No. I'm going to mark off a timeline up here. So I'm going to be moving the whole night. And as one person said to me, you don't need PowerPoint for this lecture. You are a human PowerPoint. So the point of PowerPoint is to keep everybody on track, and I hope you'll do that. But we'll be marking off a timeline up here. Creation is down there, and 2010 is down here. Hopefully the timeline will go further than that, and the world won't end in 2012 and so on. But we're going to be talking about, with the little exception at the beginning, I'll go a little further. But for most of the evening, we'll be dealing with just 25 years on a timeline. So now before I start, I have no idea of how many of you, where you consider yourself on the religious spectrum. But I do a lot of speaking at university campuses and enjoy it very much. And I often start like this. If you're here tonight and you're non-Christian or you're a skeptic, especially if you're here with a Christian friend, I've got an objection for you to give your Christian friend. You can ask him right after this is over. And it's a good objection. I personally think that a lot of Christians, most Christians I'd say, struggle with this question. And here's the question. The skeptic's asking the Christian. You want me to believe the man? Yeah. Answer, yes. The man's in the book. This is the New Testament. Yes. Well, I don't believe the book, so I don't believe the man. Now, you Christians, where would you go with that? I don't believe the book, so I don't believe the man, if your friend says that to you. Now, there's several problems and pitfalls with trying to go after that question. One is, those of you who'd raise your hand and say, I think I have an idea where I go, that discussion on defending this book such that it can be admitted as data is a long discussion, goes a long way. And I think probably when the discussion's over and both of you are just panting and sick to death of where you've come, then the guy says, now let's talk about the resurrection. And you both say, please, let's make it another day. Just tiring. Is there some way we can get there shorter and with a little different textual outlook? Okay? At no point tonight in the lecture will I argue that anything I'm saying is true because the Bible is the Word of God. Okay, State University campus, we'll be treating this like a claim for which there is or is not data. And if it really is data, it's not going to be data that's only admissible to a certain percentage of people who are believers, and those who are not don't see it. And I mean, you still may not see it, but we don't have to make some claim to privilege that if you don't understand this text, you don't understand the lecture. I'm not going to claim then, at any point, that something's true because the Bible said so. Whether that's true or not is beside the point. I'm going to go after a different approach tonight, such that the lecture would work out something like this. If the Bible were the Word of God, which is not anything we're discussing tonight, but if the Bible were, well, then Jesus is raised from the dead. If it's not, and it's a decent book with problems, and it's a pretty good historical text, I'm going to argue Jesus is still raised from the dead. But if all the New Testament is, let's call it the lowest common denominator view of the New Testament, if all this book is a book of ancient literature, that's it. I'm going to argue that Jesus is still raised from the dead. So all that's required for me to use the text in that way, this book to be very old and to have words on it, written by people, and that's it. Because I'm going to argue like this. I'm going to argue a method that I call minimal facts method, and I'm going to say that I'm going to use data, the data I'm going to admit tonight to our court, let's say, are the data that are allowed by the vast majority of specialists who study this. I say specialists because there are loose cannons on both sides of the discussion. For example, of course Jesus has been raised from the dead, I'm a Christian. Or, of course he's not been raised from the dead, I'm an atheist. And the Christian says, but those things happen all the time. And the atheist says, those things never happen. Those are affirmations or denials. Neither one of them, outside of being a personal testimony, neither one of them has a place in what I'm doing tonight. I'm asking, do we have data that indicate, I'm not even asking if the resurrection is a miracle. I'm asking, is there a good basis that a person who, to all intent and purposes, was dead in time and space, was seen afterwards? That's it. I'm not asking who did it. I'm not asking why it was done. I'm just saying, is there a basis to believe that people saw this individual, persons saw this individual after their demise? That's it. And I'm going to admit as evidence data that the vast majority of the specialist community of historians, philosophers, New Testament scholars, theologians who study this data would admit as evidence. Now sometimes, I've done a lot of things in this subject, so sometimes critics respond to me and they'll say this. Habermas thinks this issue can be solved by doing a head count. I do not. I want to make this real clear. I am interested in where scholars are across the spectrum. And I'm just as interested, maybe more interested, in where atheists and skeptics and agnostics of various definitions are than I am as to where believers are. I really, really am interested. But here's what I'm more interested in, why they hold the positions they hold. If we can agree, and the ones I'll be citing tonight, I'll give you any number, Q&A, whatever, I'll give you a lot during the lecture. Any number of critics who will agree to these things. Here's my question. If 90, 95, 98, 99% of surveyed skeptics agreed to this, to data XYZ, if that were true, why do they think it's true? And my guess is, from those who give these lists of data, my guess is they would say, we have reasons to hold that these are historical facts. We don't hold them by faith. We hold them, I'm not saying faith doesn't come in, I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying these facts are on the page because they can be tested the way historians do normal history. And someone says, well, historians can't check for the supernatural. And I'll say, that's not my topic tonight. My topic was a person who, for all intent and purposes, was dead, was he seen afterwards? Not as a shining something, not as this or that. I just want to know, was he seen afterwards? Or is that an illegitimate claim? And I'm using data that everybody puts on the table. So next question might be, well, how do you know what 90, 94, 95, 99, 100% of the scholars who write, how do you know where they are? I have a real easy answer to that. I counted. Now, if you want to take the time to count, we can argue about head count. But I did my doctoral dissertation at Michigan State back in 1976, and in the, mid-90s, I thought, it's about time I update my bibliography and see where scholarship is on this topic. And so I started with an effort just to do a few skeptical sources, don't want to rewrite my dissertation. Maybe I'll check 25 people, maybe 50. I'll take a little document here, maybe 20 pages long. I'll say where people are across the page, and I'll have updated my bibliography. The project is still going on. My teaching assistant, Ronnie's back there in the crowd. He's a PhD student at Liberty. He's probably, well, he's definitely the latest, but he's one of about 5 TAs that are working on this project. And so far, we've cataloged 3,300 sources on the resurrection, friend and foe, skeptic and believer, French, German, and English, from 1975 to the present. Now, I don't claim to have read all these, cataloged all of these. I just got done telling him the other day I need him to stop the thing he's doing, and we need to go back to head count because we're falling behind on the sources. These things are coming out very frequently. And my little 20, 30-page document as to where scholarship is has swollen to just under 600 pages. It's not my comment on them. It is simply my recording where these guys are on 140 sub-questions. I mean, you wonder, can you think of how many questions there are between what Christians call Good Friday and Easter Sunday and just a few days after that? Over 140 sub-questions. And all I've done is map scholars where they are across the spectrum. And if a particular number of people throw out a certain fact and say, yeah, we can't go with that, I throw it out. Not because I think it should be out or in, but because I'm asking the question, where is scholarship today? Okay, so those are the ground rules. That's my method. I won't talk a whole lot more about that. But what I'm going to share with you up here is the conclusion of the vast majority, let's say the consensus view of specialists. And again, I'm saying specialists because I don't want just anybody sounding off and giving their 2 cents. They have to have some background for making their claim. I don't care where they're coming from belief-wise, but I want to know what they do with the data. Okay. Now I'm going to step down here and we'll start our human PowerPoint. And I'm going to call this ground zero. This is the cross. This is crucifixion. I'm going to call it ground zero because we're not exactly agreed on what date it had to be. By far the most common dates are 30 AD with an honorable mention, second place, to 33 AD. And the reason those years are off a little bit, we're not saying 30 and 31, is because we know that this happened during Passover season, spring of the year, and because of that, you have to go for full moon. That's a long explanation, but you have to get everything just right, where the full moon would show up on a Passover in the year 30 and the year 33, and what are the candidates, and so it's not every year, and so on and so on. So, and I'll just call it ground zero. Now I will say 30, 33 throughout the debate, but you can just think of it as ground zero, because if it's 33, everything just moves up 3 years. Actually, a lot of the years will be the same, but the plus or minus will be 3 years, okay? Now, if you ask the average Christian or New Testament scholar, how do you know you have a reliable picture of Jesus in the New Testament? And I'm not going to do the reliability picture, but for a few moments here, I'm going to contrast the common view you hear with the one I'm going to use. And I think the common view can be worked out. I call it the reliability approach, and the argument goes like this. The New Testament's a reliable source. Yes, there's some issues. Yes, we can talk through these things, but it's a reliable source for these 60 reasons, and as a reliable text, I can admit the following things as data. And here's how that argument's given. Again, I'm just going to outline it quickly, and then I won't return to it. Here's how the argument works. You ask me, what's the best way to talk about this event and the things that came just days afterwards? And I'm going to say, have you seen the Gospel of Mark? Now, I'm going to use critical dating here. So if this doesn't match what some of you Christians think are the dates, you think he's way too late, I'm going to use critics' dates, okay? So the scholar might say, have you heard the Gospel of Mark? It's only 60, 65, 70, 75, let's say 70, plus 40. It's plus 40 from ground zero, right? Subtract 30 from 70 approximately. And Matthew is only 10 years later at plus 50. Luke is only 5 years later at plus 55. And everybody puts John out here at about plus 95 or plus 65. And the typical response is, hey, this is plenty early for admissible data because plus 40 to plus 65 in the ancient world is very, very early. Let me give you some examples. What if you wanted to learn about a very well-known figure in the past, Alexander the Great? We have two major biographies of Alexander, Arrian and Plutarch. And the biographies are, the earliest is more than 400 years after Alexander lived. So Alexander's way back there, about 330 BC, or BCE, if you prefer. And our earliest sources are from past this wall and up to about 118, 120 AD. 330, 120, about 450 years later. Say, okay, but I think you're picking a straw man. We have better sources than that for people. Okay, let's use a contemporary of Jesus, and a very prominent one. When Jesus was crucified, the Caesar on the throne was Tiberius. Tiberius died, depending on what date you have for the cross, just a few years after Jesus did. We have about 9 sources for Tiberius in the ancient data, but 4 major ones. Oh, well, that sounds like a nice comparison. 4 against 4. Or use the 9. Yeah, let's use the 9 for a minute. We have 9 sources, 9-ish sources for Tiberius. How many do you have for Jesus? Well, if you let anything be admitted that has a claim to being helpful here, 27 New Testament books. There's a half dozen very helpful Christian sources outside the New Testament. And then someone says, well, yeah, but that's your problem. All your sources are Christians. Not so. We have 12.5 sources for Jesus outside the New Testament, not a single one being Christian. Secular sources. You can put together a life of Jesus, including supernatural claims and supernatural events, including the comment that Jesus was raised from the dead, and only open secular books from about this time period and a little beyond that wall. In other words, 100, 150 years after Jesus lived. Okay? So 9 for Tiberius, and a few dozen for Jesus. Okay, let's go back to that 4. All right, let's talk about the 4. 4 major sources for Tiberius. The first one is contemporary with Tiberius. Whoa, strike one for the Christians. It's contemporary. That's good. But here's the weakness of the contemporary source, Paterculus. Here's the weakness. It's the least useful of the 4 sources. Historians will rely on this. It gives them the least amount of information. It's the least useful. It is contemporary. That's great. That's fantastic. It's the least helpful. Second best source for Tiberius, and this is arguably the most useful one. Second best source for Tiberius. And I'm going to keep going about 10 feet. Second best source is Tacitus, about 120 AD. Well, that's not horrible in ancient history. See, I use the same standard for non-Christian sources as Christian sources. 120 is okay, but 120 is getting a little late. What's the third source? Suetonius, from about the same time as Tacitus, maybe 5 years later. Okay, what's the fourth source for Tiberius? Dio Cassius, 180, plus 180. About 212 AD, way out there. So contemporary, but we learn our least. This is Tiberius, plus 80, plus 85, and plus 180. You say, well, wait a minute. You're comparing the Gospels to those sources as if they were on even grounds. They're not. The Gospels are religious propaganda. What do you mean by religious propaganda? Books in which people have a vested interest, so they might slight their point. Okay. But in the Roman Empire, it was official religion to worship the emperors. The same Suetonius we've talked about, he wrote, his work is the 12 Caesars. And by 5 of the 12 Caesars' names, just look at the table of contents, by 5 of the 12 Caesars' names, you see 2 words after it. Later deified, later deified, later deified, and later deified. 5 times out of 12. These Caesars are God. They do miracles. Tacitus gives a couple reports of them doing miracles. And nobody would say these guys can't write history. Well, Christians are way more slanted than that. All right, well, see, after a while, that claim starts looking like it's a little bit slanted. Because one religion can admit data, another religion can't admit data. Now, I was doing this last night at Appalachian State University. I didn't tell them this. This is a really important point. But not all religions are created equal. I know that's not fun to say today. But I have a book, until recently it was sitting right next to my desk. My wife will tell you there's too many things sitting right next to my desk. You know what that's like? Too many things in your office. It's called The Buddhist Scriptures by a Buddhist scholar with a PhD. It's not somebody who's unsympathetic. PhD, award-winning Buddhist author, and he's got a bunch of selected readings. And here's what he says in the beginning. He says, Christians have accounts of their founder. Then they have accounts that they call his words. Then they have accounts of those who walked and talked with him. And then they have another body of genre from people who learned from the people who sat with him. He said, we have nothing like that in the Buddhist tradition. He said, our earliest accounts are from hundreds of years later. Now, it's hard to tell because they don't know exact dates, but they'd say, 500 years. That's kind of fair. So you're taking, I mean, how good would your history be? How would Christians be laughed out of court if their earliest source was plus 500? So I'm just saying, according to a lot of standards, the Gospels measure up pretty well. Okay, enough of that. That's the reliability approach. I'm going to let it go. I'm just saying I think there's some real value there. You have to be careful because there's some pitfalls that Christians usually don't watch for, and they can kind of blow themselves up if they're not careful. But if you can avoid them, that's a fair approach. I'm going to use a different one. And instead of saying Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, or the extra biblical sources, which some people might like to talk about, I'm going to use a different approach. I'm going to use 2 chapters from 2 books that are unanimously in the critical world. I mean, you might find 1 or 2 people who disagree. This is about as near as unanimous in the scholarly community, and it makes no difference whether you ask the skeptics or believers, who is the best writer in the New Testament? Best as in most reliable. Paul. Let me cite a very well-known skeptic of Christianity. Michael Martin, retired from Boston University, one of his books, The Case Against Christianity, he's an atheist, and he says this, we only have one witness to resurrection appearances who writes for the New Testament. Now, if you're a Christian, does that make you happy or does it make you sad? You go, oh, no way. We've got at least blank witnesses to the resurrection. Or when someone gives you a good source, do you take it and run? Tonight I'm going to take it and run. I'm going to build my whole case on 2 texts that are unanimously attributed to Paul. You will get virtually no argument in the scholarly community that 1 Corinthians and Galatians are penned by the Apostle Paul. Skeptics say, I mean, even guys like G.A. Wells, who believe that Jesus probably didn't exist, he'll say that 7 or 8 of the 13 books that bear Paul's name are authentic books written by Paul, and that Paul's a great source of information in those books. G.A. Wells. Galatians and 1 Corinthians is always in that list. In fact, some people say that 1 Corinthians is the best attested book in the New Testament. One of the reasons it is because Paul links it to the history of the time. And for example, he talks about a leader in the city at Corinth. We know the time he got there, about 51 AD. And guess what? A placard, I mean, in cement, this guy's name has been uncovered with his rank from that time. And Paul's right, walked around, he was there, knows who's in control. I've got one critical commentary set on my shelf, and when you pull 1 Corinthians out, it says this. The author of this book is Paul. It's the best established epistle in the New Testament. We don't even have to discuss the authorship. It's a given. We move on. That's the whole discussion on authorship. And a major 12-volume commentary. Okay, enough said. I'm going to start with Paul, 1 Corinthians 15. If this is Mark at about plus 60, we're going to be about here. Paul writes this book. Critics are just as possible. It's just possible that critics will date it a little bit earlier, as believers will. It's not disputed. The date's not disputed according to whether you're liberal or conservative. It's about 55. Or plus 25. Very early, especially for ancient historiography. Now here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, first 3 verses. He says, first 2 verses, when I came to Corinth, I preached to you folks the gospel, and if you believed in that Jesus, well then you're a Christian. And if not, you're not. Pretty straightforward, first 2 verses. He says, this is the gospel that I preached. Evangelion, good news. I have a question. When the New Testament writers stated the factual content of the good news, that to which believers say, I do, or I commit my life, better or worse, rich or poor, I'm going with you, what data are they believing? Well, I'm just asking for a definition now. When the gospel is defined in the New Testament, it always comprises 3 things. Jesus' deity, Son of God, made that claim, proved it by his resurrection, whatever you want to say, claimed to be deity, died, was raised from the dead bodily. Deity, death, resurrection. Okay, Paul speaking here. He says, when I came, I proclaimed the deity, death, and resurrection, the good news to you. If you believed it, good, you're a believer. If not, you're not. And then he says this in verse 3. Extremely important words. He says, I delivered unto you that which I also received. Not hard. This is a graduate level stuff. But it's really, really important. So sometimes when I go and do lectures, I'll say, did y'all hear that? I mean, is that exciting or what? I delivered unto you what I received. You might go, I'm okay, you can move on. No, listen, I delivered unto you what I received. Okay. This is in Greek. But in the Aramaic, how would you say this in Aramaic? These are technical words for passing on tradition. Why do I say Aramaic and so on? Paul was Jewish. Native language, Aramaic. These are technical terms for passing on tradition. And it's what the Pharisees did, one of the ruling groups of scholars. And what they did was pass tradition on orally, and they preserved it. And the more important the tradition, the less any adjusting was allowed. But if you read one of Paul's other authentic books, nobody disputes, Philippians, Paul says, I was a Pharisee. Oh, okay. So you're one of those guys who delivers and receives. Paul said, I think I said that. But you're starting to get the idea here. Paul believed in checking out tradition and passing it along. Very simple words, very important concept. Paul says, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing to be a good scholar, i.e., I'm passing on data to you. I delivered unto you that which I also received. How that Christ, which is a title, right? Christ is not Jesus' last name. Christ is a title. Died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and appeared. And then here comes our earliest list of appearances. 3 individuals, James, Peter, and then Paul adds his name to the end of this. Last of all, he appeared to me. And 3 groups. A group called the 12, a group called all the apostles, and a group called 500 men at one time. I emphasize that because we often miss this in the literature. There could have been twice that number present. they were doing a head count of males. We may have time to come back to this and say why they did that, but it's a big group. 3 individuals, 3 groups. He says he appeared. If there's one conclusion in everything I'm saying tonight that is accepted by every person who writes in this field, pretty bold statement, is that the New Testament is filled with with many, dozens of what we might call one-liners. They're creedal passages, they're traditions. These are more or less synonyms. They're confessions, they're traditions, they're creeds. Because contrary to popular belief, most of Jesus' audience was illiterate. In fact, possibly as much as 90% of his hearers. So if you want to impart information, I gave you what I was given. If you want to impart information to people who are illiterate, how do you talk so that they can remember it? You don't necessarily make the concepts easier. We can understand abstract concepts. But what do? Well, think about it. You might tell stories. Parables. And you'd keep your most important teachings short, pithy, to the point, so that they can memorize them. One thing they've got us beaten on is they were memorizers. They were very good at passing on little statements. Think about all the ones we have. The Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, statements like turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, the Golden Rule, do unto others. We remember those. And 1 Corinthians 15:3 is unanimously held to be one of those early creeds that predate this book. It's much earlier in the book than which is written. When was the book written? 56. Now remember verses 1 and 2. This is what I gave to you when I came to Corinth. Oh, I gotcha. This is when you wrote it. Right. What time? 55 plus 25. But you gave it to us orally when you came. Yeah, preached. When did you come to Corinth? 51. Or plus 21. Okay, $1 million question. When and from whom did Paul receive this material? Because if you're doing this like New Testament or any other kind of historiography, you want 2 things. You want as early witnesses as you can have, as early as possible, and you want eyewitnesses, if that's possible. Remember Michael Martin? The only one we have is Paul. Everybody wants early eyewitnesses. Can the early eyewitnesses be wrong? Yep. But they sure beat late non-eyewitnesses. To have an eyewitness of some of this sure beats a biography from plus 400 or plus 120. All right. When and from whom did Paul receive this material? The conclusion I'm going to give you here has recently been called by a leading New Testament scholar from Cambridge University. It's been called, this is the consensus view. This isn't what you hear in the church down the street or what Christians. In fact, most Christians don't even know this date. You're not taught this. You know why? Most Christians are taught like this. This is the New Testament. It's the Word of God. There are no problems with it. It's totally God's Word for us. So when I try to break out a little passage from this book, people think, I mean, that's great, but why are you doing that? The whole thing's God's Word. But that's not the approach I'm taking tonight. I'm asking, what can we do with this text? And so it does make a lot of difference when and from whom did Paul receive this material. Okay, here's where we are, and here's where we're going to start. The roller coaster's going to start moving down the hill. He wrote it, 55-ish, plus 25-ish. He was there, orally, plus 21. When and from whom did Paul receive this material? This is not a conclusion arrived at by conservatives. This comes from the critical community. Paul most likely received this material here. Now, if it were here, it'd be contemporary with Jesus. That's how early this is. It's just here. +5. Well, how in the world do you guys know that? Well, first of all, it's not you guys. Non-Christians came up with this. I'll tell you the story later if you want to know, but I should say non-Christians. A lot of the guys are claiming to be Christians, but a lot of the guys are claiming to be skeptics. I'll give you a whole list of skeptics who concede this. Atheists. Atheist New Testament scholars, if you want a list. But here's the math. The other passage, Galatians chapter 1, Paul starts like this. Galatians, the whole book is about the nature of the gospel, right? Deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. Paul says, I hated that message. Here's how he starts out the book. I hated it. I was a persecutor. I grabbed men, women, and children, tore them out of their houses, put them in prison, or worse. I was not a friend of the church. And then I met Jesus on the road to Damascus. That's what Michael Martin means when he says, Paul's the only eyewitness whose testimony we have. And that's why Paul is believed to be more trustworthy than the Gospels. We can talk about that. But critics concede that Paul is reliable. Reliable as in what? Reliable as in trained scholar, was there for this, or believed he was there. And he's the right guy at the right time to be answering these questions because he knows what he's talking about. Now, can he be wrong? Yeah. This is the critic's view. He can be wrong. But man, he's sure in the right place to get it right. And he got to win? About +5. How do you do the math? Here's how you do it. The cross. 30 or 33 AD, but it's ground zero. When does Paul think he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus? Critics usually say 1, 2, or 3 years after this point. Let's take an average, 2. So I think it was 3. Great. It's 2. Okay, good. Paul believes he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus about +2. And then in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, well, as soon as he talks about it, 16, he says, I didn't go running up to Jerusalem right away to meet those guys who were apostles before me for a whole 2 years. He said, I didn't run up there to see those who were leaders before me. I mean, why did I have to? I got it from Jesus himself. He said, so I went away for 3 years to think about these things and to study the Old Testament. He was a Pharisee. I went away and studied these things for 3 years, and then I went to Jerusalem. All right, you all with me? Ground zero. Meets Jesus, +2. Goes to Jerusalem, +3. 2 + 3, 5. Go, I think it's conversions +3. Wonderful, +6. So Paul's in Jerusalem, and he said, I went up there to check these things out. And I saw none of the apostles except Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. I stayed with him for 15 days. Now, what did I talk about? Well, the theme of the whole book, Galatians, is the nature of the gospel. That's a good hint. Number 2, if you're Paul, the one who said, I preach nothing but Christ and him crucified, if that's what you preach, then what else? I mean, I don't know what else you brought up, but you have to bring that up in 15 days. And besides, as you're going to see in a minute, he tells us the topics of the gospel. All right, so he's here, +5, right time, right place, right people. What would you pay for a weekend to hear Paul, Peter, and James together in Jerusalem, +5? That'd be a good ticket. That'd be better than the Who at the at the Super Bowl last week. They were pathetic. Okay, what would you pay to see these guys? And they're talking about the gospel. All right, let's just push forward about 3 verses. There's no verses in the originals. That's done so we can find chapters and verses together. Chapter 2, verse 2. Paul says, 14 years later, this guy's helpful. 14 years later, I went back up to Jerusalem. This is usually dated by, so for example, Helmut Kester, skeptic, Rudolf Bultmann, dated to about 48 AD. Very early, plus 18. If you think he died in 33, plus 15. I went back up to Jerusalem 14 years later, and Galatians 2:2 is one of the most interesting verses, one of the top 5 most interesting verses of the New Testament. You can read it and go, what? Here's Galatians 2:2. I set before them the gospel that I was preaching. He went back up to see the apostles. I set before them the gospel I was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. What? Yeah, I put the gospel on the table to make sure we were all on the same page. I want to make sure that I had this right and that I wasn't preaching the wrong thing for 14 years. Paul, you've been preaching for 14 years and now you want to see if you're preaching the right thing? I think Paul says, you're not listening. Not listening, let me do it again. No, Paul, please, don't do it again. Today, I say this lovingly, I think Paul was obsessive compulsive. How do I do it? This guy does things over and over again because he knows what needs to be done. He says, listen, lesson number 1, I got it from Jesus, so I'm pretty sure I'm right. I already talked to Peter and James. I think I'm right again. This is at least my 3rd trip. Depending on what you do with Acts chapter 15, this might be his 4th trip. 4th trip. I gave you what I was given. How many times did you check this out? Oh, just 3 or 4 times with the number 1 scholars on the face of the earth. All right, I give. It's not your first time checking it out. It's at least your 3rd and maybe your 4th. Yeah. You know something? I think Paul wore these boys out. Peter, fisherman. James, I don't know, probably a carpenter, brother of Jesus. John, because John's in this passage now. Now what would you pay for Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John? The 4 most influential Christians in the early church. They're all together. Could you imagine these 3 guys, 2 fishermen and a carpenter, presumably? You can't email a guy, I'll be there tomorrow. They look up, and here comes Paul down the sidewalk. Oh, no. This guy wears me out. He's going to make all of us get pads and paper and take notes, and we all have to have the exact same copy of notes before we leave. James, you're the brother of Jesus, and you're the pastor of this here church. Will you talk to him? Not me, bro. You're the head apostle. You're the big fisherman. You're the tough guy. You talk to him. Yeah, but that's it. I'm a fisherman. I'm not a scholar. John, easygoing guy, the disciple whom Jesus loved. You don't argue with anybody. Will you? And by that time, Paul's at the door. Hey, guys, just thought we'd come talk about the gospel. Oh. That's how I picture it going down. But we benefit from Paul's obsessiveness. Would you want somebody not to be obsessive, to invent his message like people say Christians did? To invent his message and just teach it willy-nilly, and then you find out, like skeptics say, number 1's preaching this message, number 2 is preaching this one, number 3 is preaching this one, number 4 is preaching this one? People ask me, it's one of those common questions I get today. How come you guys didn't include all the Gospels when you finished the New Testament canon? They did. You ever think about that? They did. When they ended the canon about 100 AD, they took every gospel available. It's not their fault. There were only 4. Well, I got 4 others for you. Well, yeah, we can make that in a second canon if you want to close the second one in 400 AD or 300 AD. But if you only want 4, if you want to go at 100 AD, that's all we have is 4. And do you want 4 different, you want just unresearched willy-nilly? Or do you want guys who've been there and discussing this? I like that. And I like good research. He delivered unto them that which he received. He wrote it, plus 25. Sound like Paul, a little obsessive. He said it, plus 21. He received it from two of the biggies, about +5. And he did it again, and maybe twice, depending on what you do with Acts 15, about 18 years after the fact. Now let's go back to this one, because in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, we see how much of a researcher Paul was. Yep, we got the delivered and received and all that, and it's very, very early. We're going to the horse's mouth. We're getting the authoritative message. You may not like the message, and that's your right, but we're going to the people who are there. Paul uses a word in Galatians 1:18 that we destroy in our English translations, usually. He says, I spent 15 days in Jerusalem, and I saw Peter and James. Some translations say, got acquainted. But the word is hysteresai. Root word, histor. I'll transliterate for you from the Greek. Histor. It's the word from which we get our word history. Now, I'm not going to pull a fast one on you and say, well, since that's a word for history, Paul is saying he was playing the historian's role. That's not really the way the word was used in the first century. But in 3 word studies that I know of, none of which are conservative, the conclusion is hystoresai, and histor in particular, ought to be translated as being the investigative reporter. We have little phrases. Go check it out. Been there, done that. 2 heads are better than 1. We have all these little phrases that mean, hey, check it out for yourself. Don't believe me? I'm not twisting your arm. Take a walk. Go see it. That's what hysteresai means. Now, some of you, if you've not ever heard this kind of material before, you might say, see, that's what I don't like about you Christians. You're always changing your translations. That just is repeated so much. No one is changing any translation. The question is, what does the original word histor mean? We're arguing about a dictionary definition. Well, no one's changing the word or trying to make it a different word or no. Now you say that's what it means. That's what it meant in the first century. In fact, it's used in one piece of papyri, the earliest kind of writing. It's used of a geographer who's checking out a river. And to be doing this means checking it out firsthand. Here's the river. Here's the white water. A little dry here. Portage your canoe or whatever. There's a town. Here's a bluff. A lot of trees. Keep going. It gets deep here. Because he's been there. That's how the word's used in the first century. No one's making up a word. The word's always been there. We just try to find more documents that tell us how the word is used. And Paul says, when I came to these guys, asking them about the gospel, I wanted to play the role of the investigative reporter. I wanted to check it out. What subject? Gospel. What data? Deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And he comes back, and so on. Okay, how are we doing on time? All right, we'll be done in a few minutes here. All right, but if we stopped right here, and I think this is a revolutionary conclusion, but if we stopped right here at +5, most people don't have a clue that Christianity comes that close to the sources, and that you have the unanimity that you have from the big 4, Paul, Peter, James, John. We can do a lot better than that. In case you so you don't miss what I'm saying, this is when Paul received the material. Oh, so somebody had it before Paul. That's the point. I gave you what I was given. They had it before Paul. Well, if he got it from Peter and James, we don't have a lot of room to go here. They had it before he had it. Now, the nature of New Testament creeds is that it takes a while to get them in stylized form. To be an early creed, I mean, for example, this one in Greek, it's thought to have 2 stanzas, and it reads like this in the Greek. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Now, it doesn't rhyme like English poetry. but it has a cadence like Hebrew does. And it was easily memorizable, okay? Here's when Paul got it. They had it before he had it. It takes a while to convert a story into a cadence, or let's just say to make a hymn, a melody, a ditty, something we can all sing about. So the events on which this is based are earlier still. Y'all with me? Paul got it. They had it before him. It takes a little while to formalize these words, and here we are. The latest research, I mean months-old research on this topic, is that this material goes all the way back to the beginning. How early? I'm talking about early eyewitness testimony. Goes all the way back to the beginning. How so? Well, Richard Bauckham, the New Testament scholar I was telling you about from Cambridge University, he's totally reversed his view on this. His view used to be, it took Christians, this is his old view, it took Christians till about here to start realizing that Jesus was the Son of God and had the attributes of deity. It took the Christians that long. That doesn't mean he wasn't back then. That just means it took them time to unpack it. Now Bauckham says, nah, I've changed my view. The data say, because of this new early research, that two things came out of the gate in 30 AD. You had to have two things from the beginning. You know why you had to have them from the beginning? There'd be no Christianity without them. So there's nothing to preach if you don't have a message. What's the centermost message? It's the gospel. People die, so it's the other two, the deity and resurrection, that are most crucial. And Bauckham says, our evidence shows, this is a very long, involved argument. I'd be glad to do it with the Q&A with you if you want. But Bauckham says two things had to be present out of the gate when Christianity was, quote unquote, launched. Deity of Christ. I didn't say he was deity. I'm saying that teaching was there at the beginning, right? Because I told you I'm not talking about the supernatural, only the reports of. He's the Son of God, raised from the dead. Larry Hurtado, head of the religion department, Edinburgh University. He's been studying this subject since 1975, 35 years, just released 2 books, an almost 500-page book called Lord Jesus Christ, and a smaller book called How on Earth Did Jesus Become a God? From a major press, and Hurtado's conclusions, two things had to be there from the beginning, or there'd be no Christianity. Deity of Christ, and the preaching, teaching, deity of Christ, resurrection. It didn't evolve mythologically. They didn't copy off people. It was their earliest belief. And here's the latest. A guy who's as influential in New Testament studies as there is, just recently retired from the University of Durham and England, James D.G. Dunn, and he said they preached this immediately and converted it to the form within 6 months of the cross. Not 5 years, that's when Paul got it. It was already into an early memorizable form 6 months. Now, I did this last night, and there's a professor present in the philosophy and religion department, and he said, the guys you're using are major scholars, but they're moderate to moderate plus. Do you have any, these are my words for the scholars. He said they're moderates. He said, do you have any really skeptical guys who agree with this? Yeah. In fact, if you want a bunch of names, and all of these are somewhere between atheist, agnostic, somewhere in there. You got all the following. Garrett Ludeman. He's sometimes called an atheistic New Testament professor. I don't know if he's exactly an atheist, but he's down there that people call him an atheist. So he's on the skeptical end. I understand his hearsay. I understand he lectured the Jesus seminar, the guys that throw the beads in the hat and reject 80 to 90% of Jesus' red letter words, not conservative. He once lectured them that they were too understanding and allowed too many red letter passages. And Garrett Ludeman, German New Testament scholar, says The oldest this material could have been proclaimed in a dot, 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 dot form